Welcome back to Top Lines and Tails. This week's episode is kindly sponsored by Harbro, suppliers and manufacturers of quality livestock nutrition. Welcome to a slight variation on our history of UK native livestock this week, in that we're not only studying the history of the breed, but the man who was responsible for it. Robert Bakewell lived from 1725 to 1795 and can be hailed perhaps as one of the most important agricultural figures in history. Himself from a long line of dignitaries that dated back 600 years back towards Henry II, certainly some of his family did, and it was his grandfather who took over the tenancy of Dishley Grange in Leicestershire in 1693. And then his father took it over from him and continued to develop it, and positively encouraged his son Robert III in pretty much everything he did from an early age. My guest today is cattle historian Clive Davies. Welcome back, Clive.
Hi, Andy. Good to be with you.
Clive, I believe you've studied Bakewell in quite a bit of detail. I think from what I gather, the farm was 440 acres, 3/4 of that being down to grazing, and on this in 1770 anyway, he ran 60 horses, 400 sheep and 160 cows of various breeds, and that's an extremely dense cropping race, even for today's style. And he was unmarried, I gather, and the house at Dishley Grange was run by his sister Hannah and was quite some mansion, I think, and it had been a monastery originally, Clive.
Yes, apparently so, Andy. I mean, the whole concept of Bakewell's life I find absolutely fascinating, and the fact that he was ahead of his time, so much so that a lot of his findings we haven't even taken on yet, as it were. You know, I think it's an incredible story of the achievements of a man who worked with livestock.
Of course, and it should be noted, I suppose, that other contemporaries of that time would be the likes of Turnip Townsend, a man who had already made great strides in the arable side of things, and of course Jethro Tull, who revolutionised a lot of farm machinery, including the invention of the seed drill. But Bakewell would have been born in a time, Clive, in the livestock world anyway, when animals were mainly used for draft, and that was his wanting to change them, particularly the cattle, of course, into more meat-producing stock, that the nation was rapidly requiring meat at that time.
Yes, well, his life was sort of, the middle of his life was 100 years before Britain became urbanized as such, in that there were more urban people than rural people, which was about in 1850. So, like, he was looking forward so much that he felt that people would need more food, and of course he was spot on. And as you say, Andy, those primitive cattle of the times of the early 1700s weren't meat yielding at all. I mean, that's what they ended up as they were removed from the ploughing teams or from carting. But even the sheep and that, they were very poorly conformed in the standard that we'd expect now, and indeed in the standard that Bakewell himself expected. And well, that was one of his big sayings, was that you can't eat bone, we'll give them what they can eat. And also being a tenant farmer was so interesting. I mean, you've mentioned those other people, and Bakewell managed to mix with all sorts. I mean, King Farmer George III was a good friend of his, and because of the king's interest in agriculture, of course, it helped Bakewell meet other people, I'm sure. And so it was a most fascinating life of a Leicestershire tenant farmer who really travelled the length and breadth of the UK, but he also brought in animals from Europe to improve those of his own, especially his horses. So, like, he was a much-travelled man, which seems absolutely amazing in the time of the early 18th century.
One of the sad things about that is he was a very private man, and we'll maybe go on to that in a minute as with the reason for that. But being a private man, he didn't tend to write things down and tell people what he was doing or what he'd done and how he got there. So we're reliant a little bit on hearsay of people around that time and writers to give us this extraordinary story, such as the the great agriculturist Arthur Young, who pops up regularly on this podcast when we're talking about history. Somebody went around and sort of documented all these things, and I think Arthur Young took a particularly interest in Bakewell's dealings. And one of the things that's said about him was that Bakewell was particularly kind to his animals, which in turn were known to be extremely placid. And I think perhaps back in the day, there'd be a lot of drovers would be hitting animals with sticks. And I think the whole understanding of being kind to an animal, it'd be kind back to you, and developing a placid animal is something that came through certainly in the Longhorn breed, which are renowned to be a docile breed, and compared to some of the others we won't mention.
Well, he was a very principled man, I think, and reasonably religious, fairly religious by today's standards, probably. I mean, he wouldn't sort of be working on Sundays, or, as you say, his upbringing from his parents and his grandfather, and working with his sister and her family. He's a very principled man. And going back to your comment about his records, well, I'm sure he did keep some, but that's the most disappointing thing, that those records of his own haven't been maintained. That the reports that we have of his work are mostly through people like Arthur Young and Hewitt and people like that who were regular contacts, friends of his indeed, and they would record things. And later on, I'm sure we'll talk about George Cully, who was a student of his. Well, they exchanged letters frequently, and thankfully some of those remain, and hopefully still do, in safekeeping in museums and agricultural institutions. And so we have got a pretty accurate view of work that he did do. What we haven't quite got is all the detail that he must have recorded in his work and his experiments, because that's what he was doing. He was experimenting. Yeah. And I think that he was the forerunner of our nation's need to find out more about agricultural methods and husbandry. And so whilst his livestock sort of hasn't been carried on forever sort of thing, at least the scene that he set and the people that he inspired have been able to take this nation on as a great livestock breeding nation, and I regard him as the father of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it would be wrong to say that some of it wasn't romanticised. I'm sure, as a lot of these things were. Certainly some of the paintings and drawings that we see take a poetic license to put things more extreme, but I think we should have a lot of faith in Arthur Young. He's certainly the man that seems to have been about and recorded things correctly. And if we move on, I mentioned earlier on the stock numbers that he had on the farm there. I mean, it's said that he was known to leave his calves on their mothers for quite a long time, and a fairly simple task, really, but that required good grazing, and that would encourage early growth in the animals by leaving them on their mother's milk. But the numbers that he had, Clive, on a farm back in those days, he'd need some pretty good grazing, and I think his secret was to house all the cattle in the winter and then use the manure from that to go on the grassland, something that's bread and butter to all farmers these days, and unheard of at the time, wasn't it? And the winter stock would be housed and fed on carrots and turnips and, again, new types of forage at the time. So it wasn't just about the animals, it was the whole husbandry side of it that made a farm so much more efficient.
Well, the management of the farm, Andy. I mean, he was intent on improving his grass lays, so he ploughed and he reseeded. And then, as you point out, he fertilised, and that was the stored dung of the animals from the winter time. And he devised methods of collecting that more effectively and efficiently. He'd rather feed straw to the cattle because he felt that that's all they needed. Well, not only all they needed, but I mean, that was their principal form of their diet, to turn it into dung. But then he found probably he needs some of that straw to absorb the urine and the liquid, which of course have got nutrition within it. So he kept developing those systems. But most remarkably, he invested into irrigation. Yeah. I think Dishley Grange was adjacent. It was between two waterways, Blackbrook to the north, the River Soar to the south. So he was able to utilise the water that those waterways gave. But I mean, he must have spent had help to spend many hours arranging these canals and ditches so as to be able to move water around the farm. And then he was able to sort of flood irrigate, or however he must have done it like that, and then grow the grass that much better. But he'd be cutting like 4 crops of hay in those days, of course, and it must have been absolutely mind-blowing to his neighbours.
What I find fascinating there, Clive, is that he constructed a canal right through the middle of the farm, which was obviously, as you said, using it for irrigation, but then he suddenly realised that we've got this canal here that's flowing from one river to the other quite slowly, and then he used that canal to ship his crops back up towards the barn, so he was flowing the right direction. He'd load all the turnips on there onto a flat-bottom barge and let them float up to the other end, and then seemingly he decided not to use the barge, and he just would throw the roots just into the canal, knowing the turnip would float, and then they'd go down the canal, getting washed as they went, and then pick them out the other end ready washed. And then he'd use that canal as well to send the manure out to the fields back down the river on the boat. I mean, what a smart thinking man to dig a river through your middle of your farm. I don't think many people have done that in the last year or two.
Well, no, I haven't met anybody who's done it. Like I said, this fellow's way ahead of his time, so he hadn't even tried half of the things that he was doing. The thing about the turnips, that makes me smile tremendously. I think Arthur Young featured that in his Annals of Agriculture under the title "Navigation of Turnips." That to me sounds like something from Blackadder to me. But what a smart fella!
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And we move on to some of the things that he bred, and of course he's known for 2, 3, 4 different breeds. But we'll start with the sheep, Clive. And neither of us are maybe experts in, and there's not a great deal of history about the sheep that he did, but there would be a few other local sheep breeders, such as Joseph Allam around there. But once Bakewell set about specialising in improving the type of sheep he wanted, he'd used sheep from other areas rather than his local ones, and he used sheep from Lincolnshire originally to get his foundation stock to breed what became the Dishley Leicester, which was obviously his own breed. And at the time when a lot of the sheep around there would be god-awful specimens, really, he had a clean sheet to start and create something that almost like Frankenstein that wasn't really around him.
Yeah, I think that Allen fella was, he must have been an interesting chap if we could have found out more about him, because I think he started to make improvements to the sheep in those Midland counties. But certainly Bakewell's drive to produce more meat from less inputs meant that he wanted a fairly compact sheep compared to the sort of native sheep of that area, which would just be described as bony and lanky and perhaps not very well wooled, because a good fleece on a sheep adds to its appearance of a good doing sheep. And so he brought in genetics from the Lincoln long wools, which obviously a big framey sheep. I mean, I'm just capable of shearing sheep, but I think if I shore one Lincoln, I wouldn't want to shear a second, And so he was using those genetics that were available to him. But of course, whatever he bred, Andy, his main theme was breeding in, as he would call it. I'll call it line breeding. You can call it whatever you like. And so what he did, he selected breeding stock that was desirable to use, and then started to concentrate those breed lines together so that over a period of 4, 5, 6 generations, you've got a very high concentration. In fact, he was probably using sires on daughters with all the species that he worked with, and he worked with all the species. And with these sheep, he was particularly successful in getting a result. I have seen somewhere read about sort of the dimensions of the sheep. And I mean, his sheep were standing in probably about 30, his rams 30 inches, probably at the shoulder. So they were fairly if he'd made the sheep smaller and they were still 30 inches at the shoulder, they were still some pretty substantial animals, and getting on for a good lot of length in them too. And so he did develop these Dishley Leicesters into some pretty formidable tools. And then, of course, other people became interested in what he was doing and began to use his bloodlines. Then he developed the Dishley Society, which was all about hiring of rams, and there was loads of rules associated, and everybody had to toe the line, including that if they were at a meeting and they went missing from it, they received a fine for how long they were away. And so, I mean, it was all a very well organized setup in the end, and thankfully he did it, because I'm sure that the movement of the sheep from his farm in Leicestershire, and of course right up to where Peter is there in the Scottish borders, which has given us the border Leicester and the blue-faced Leicester to south of the border, those are major sheep breeds nowadays, the influence they've had over my lifetime, the last 50 years. So his name much lives on in the sheep world, particularly with these British genetics. And then, of course, they've been the Dishley Leicester was put into many other breeds.
So as you say, that not only did the Leicester breed go on and become the basis for, of course, the Blue Leicester and the Border Leicester, two of the strongest sheep breeds in the UK, and a lot of them around the world, but of course they were introduced to a lot of other breeds to improve them, and in a lot of cases to put a bit more size and strength into them. One thing I will say, and I think we'll touch on this with Peter when we get on a little bit further down the line with the cattle side of it, is that he was starting breeding from big stock, and he would start with 2 or 3 animals and line breeding from big stock, and it is. We probably all know that it's a lot easier to breed them smaller than it is to start with small ones and breed them bigger. And I think maybe we'll leave that and touch on that with the cattle in a minute. But that is an interesting policy, that some of these animals were so huge that at least you got a big frame to start with.
You're absolutely right there, Andy. I quite concur with what you've just said. Equally, though, and this is what Bakewell was well aware of, and you've intimated at it with regards to stocking density. Like livestock breeding isn't what any individual animal is, it's what you can make it of the system that you're using, and it's all down to, in my language, what you can do with an acre of land. Mm-hmm. And therefore, whilst those animals may be larger or smaller or longer or shorter or thicker or fatter or leaner, whatever they are, it's what you can produce off that acre of land. And this was Bakewell's big driver. It was a matter of forming animals that could work and survive off limited feed input. I take his horses, for instance. I mean, he was looking for the power that a working horse needed, and he was basically the start of the Shire horse. But black horses were his favourite, because obviously in Suffolk they'd got the Suffolk Punch, and they were more red in their colour, and of course the locals in Suffolk thought they were the world's best horse, and Bakewell tended to agree with them on occasions when he saw some very good examples, but that was the driver for him to make something slightly better. And I know very, very little about equine. What I find an interesting statistic, because people often talk about the development of livestock and what we should be looking for in this, but they very rarely put statistics on it that can accurately describe it. I've seen it said of Bakewell, and he's described his ideal horse. Basically, the thing should fall into 2/3 along it, so it's head, its shoulders, its barrel, its hind quarter. But what I read, which was I found very interesting, was from its shoulder to its hip should be no more than the width of its barrel. Well, you imagine, if these horses are some fair things. They must have been a hell of a lot of width in them.
You wouldn't want to ride that one with my short legs anyway, that's for sure.
No, I'm shorter than you, Andy. But I mean, this is the sort of specification that Bakewell got into, and I'm sure he did it with his farmed livestock, his cattle and his sheep and his pigs that he worked with. That's the information that it's so sad that we haven't got, really, because I think that would reflect on us that best picture. And then coming back to your comment about it's easier to breed them smaller than larger, we know it is, but what it's all about is producing so much per acre, and this was Bakewell's big driver, and that's what formed his degree of thinking throughout his life.
Okay, let's go back and have a look just at some of those sheep. And the wool obviously was valuable at the time, and the Dishley Leicester was a medium wooled sheep, especially compared to the Lincoln, as you mentioned. But Bakewell, it was about reduction of fat mutton, and back then that was a staple diet of the poorer man, where they would have the sort of fat part of mutton and wouldn't be costing a lot. And he knew that he could produce this and start feeding a nation who were part starving, I suppose. And this sort of new breeding superseded anything else before it with regards to producing mutton by 4 or 5-fold. And wethers were killed at 2 years old, and it would often be 2 or 3 inches of fat on their ribs by that age, 2 or 3 inches. And then it's also said that compared to other breeds such as the Norfolk and the Leicester would have half the amount of bone. So twice the fat, half the bone. It's a winner, isn't it? And 2 years old was the optimum age regarding to the level of fat, but some had been taken to extremes, and it's known to have up to 7 inches of fat to be seen on a 3-year-old, Clive, although the beast's mobility might be extremely compromised by such obesity. 7 inches of fat, how about that? That'd get the pan going.
Yeah, that'd cook pretty well, wouldn't it, I would say. But, of course, that like Bakewell was a very keen advocate of sort of natural feeding methods. So that performance needed to come from the genetic value of the animal rather than the food that was taken in, because he wouldn't be too pleased with us importing soya from the southern hemisphere nowadays. I mean, that wasn't on his radar at all. It was what you could produce off the farm, that you had the livestock capable of transferring that into edible protein. And whilst he was talking about early maturity, yet his killing sheep were 2 years old. Obviously, we've yet improved upon that, that we can get lambs to slaughter at 12 to 14 weeks. So, but I mean, he was the start of this thing and a remarkable man for it.
And just moving on, the trials, he did 2 trials of his own sheep against other sheep, local breeds such as the Norfolk and the Wiltshire, and something called the Herefordshire, which I guess would be the Ryland. And I imagine there'd be a Southdown in there that was sort of starting to come in at the time. In 1785, the trials that he did was won by the Durham sheep, whatever the Durham sheep was, I'm not sure which, ate 498 pounds of turnips in a year and weighed in at 290 pounds. So that's some intake, half a ton of turnips in a year, and then a quarter of a ton of turnips, should I say, and then but that was nearly double the amount of food that the Ryland ate, and it was nearly double the size as well. So the Leicester pitched itself somewhere in the middle of that, where it could. So he'd be taking in food efficiency, wouldn't he, as well? He'd be measuring for how much they ate through a winter versus how much they weighed. Of course he would,
Andy. There we are. It's what he could do with his acre of land, And also, of course, he'd like to see these other breeds in and around him, because I'm sure in some way or other he'd ensure that the Dishley was looking the best, or sort of the best performer. And, of course, then his visitors would be able to see that the sheep from other parts weren't performing quite as well as these Dishley Leicesters, and it would help his sales and his reputation. And he was a very forward-thinking man with regard to promotion, it looks to me.
Looking between the lines and not wanting to dish the Dishley, if you like, but he was somewhat of a show-off, I think, Bakewell, as you said. He did like to have his animals parading out there in their best clothes, and he'd have had some damn good stockmen in there, I'm sure, that were looking after these trials and these various things, and turning these sheep out to perfection, which is it's a lesson to all of us, isn't it? You've got to put the gift wrapping on these things as well.
Of course you are. Yeah.
Another thing you mentioned briefly that pioneering was that this the ram letting, something that had never been done before, and of course that further advanced his product, because he could let rams out to similar flocks, or flocks maybe of his own breeding, and then he could see how they performed in their flocks, and it would give him chance to spread the genetics of his Dishley sheep out and make some money out at the same time, which was pretty smart. And then, as you said, that moved on to the creation of the formation of the Dishley Society, which you mentioned earlier on, and probably can be considered as probably one of the earliest breed societies of all time, if we can call it a breed society.
Yes, I'm sure. Yes. Well, even though he stocked his farm well, he was well aware that it's a numbers game, and more data that he could collect, the better. And that's what much encouraged him, I think, to his breeding stock out and about, so that then he could keep an eye on the performance at other places. and add to the database.
And as well as the formation of the Dishley Society, there would have been originally a small ram sale at Leicester going back the way, and he'd turned that then into a show and sale, and a whole bidding system was set up there with rules in place, as you said, where he would prohibit the best rams being let to other top producers that he didn't want to get them to get the genetics. So a smart move, really, but yeah, they're probably the beginnings of Leicester Show. Going back to the letting of these sheep, it certainly was profitable, and in 1768 it said that he earned £1,000 for letting out 20 rams. Now, that's not a bad trade even by today's standards. You can rent them out for 20 rams out for £1,000, and then and still got the rams at the end of it. And by 1789, he and his partners in the society took upwards of £10,000 for letting out their rams, and I think that's. I don't know why we're not still doing this, to be honest. To me, that sounds a pretty good way of earning some money. Let somebody else look after them for the winter, and then having them back in the summer and doing it again the following year. You know? But he would. Yep. These would only go out to the top breeders, though, wouldn't he? Wouldn't just let them out to everybody. And the society was quite a prestigious thing, I think, with members from high society such as the Duke of Bedford and a lot of dignitaries. But the graziers, the basic fattener people, they would hire rams themselves, but they would be hiring obviously lesser rams for a fraction of the price. And I suppose we can liken that a bit like today's high-flying pedigree prices, which are so far removed from the price of lamb at the butchers, and therein hangs a controversial tale that perhaps we should talk about.
But of course, what he was doing, Andy, was spreading those improved genetics, which they clearly were, and improving, well, the nation's livestock by degrees. I mean, I saw some fascinating figures produced. There's about Smithfield, about the meat market in Smithfield, and during Bakewell's lifetime, the average weight of carcasses that would have been traded there, like, improved dramatically from early in the 1700s. Beef carcasses were only like about 370 pounds, this would be, so like half of that in kilos nowadays. Lambs were around about 18 pounds in weight, so like less than 8 or 9 kilos per lamb carcass, and presumably then we're 2 to 3 years of age as well. But by the end of Bakewell's life, by 1790 or so, I mean, these beef carcasses have got up to 800 pounds, and the lambs up to 50 pounds. Yeah. So you can see that over that 100 years, the vast improvement of yield of meat in a given carcass was pretty dramatic, and it was people like Bakewell and was driving this improvement in British livestock.
Sure. Yeah. We mentioned then he's got sheep up to 290 pounds. So obviously they are getting the big tops out there to help improve the general commercial ewe, as it were. And we move on. Just you mentioned the heavy horses there quite rightly, Clive, that he's probably the father of the Shire horse, but he was in pegs as well in a fairly handy way too. I think he did the same with his bacon and ham carcasses, and he was also hailed by many as the greatest breeder of cabbage of all time. So there's no end to this man's talents, really, is there?
He was a genius without knowing it, I think.
But the breed that I think he will be most famous for would be the development of the Longhorn, which we'll cover in a few seconds. And but Bakewell wasn't without his troubles, was he? For all, an incredible man, and looking at the economy and the way of producing animals more economically, unfortunately, he went bankrupt, and he was declared bankrupt in 1776, so sort of midway through his term, if you like, from a combination, they said, of the cost of all his experiments. I mean, you don't go and dig a canal through the middle of your farm for nothing, do you? And all the other experiments he's doing. And his exuberant entertaining. So seemingly his sister Hannah and himself would put on some fairly lavish entertaining events when they're inviting people round to look at the sheep, which would be that'd be the best ticket in town, to have hold of that one, to go and look at some sheep and then get entertained.
Yeah. Well, I think it was open house, Andy. I mean, I think like if anybody come there with good intent, he was an excellent host with his sister, and I mean, it was all about spreading the word. And I mean, I suspect in all these dealings he had a few bad debts come his way. I heard a little story about that he'd hired a bull out for about £50 for the season. Unfortunately, the farmer who had hired him died during the season. The executors moved in, didn't know that this was an hired bull, got him sold for 8 or 10 quid. And then when Mr. Bakewell turns up to pick his bull up and finds that he'd gone and indeed slaughtered, well, it became a court case, which which on reputation, apparently he won. But there was probably a goodly number of incidents where animals returned not as fit as they should have been, and we can all concur with that happening. And some go missing, and some die in natural causes. So, like, it wouldn't all be profit. And as you say, his methods of doing it in the experiments would add to the cost, because there would be some failures along the way as well, I'm sure, which is how we all learn. And so, yes, he did come under some financial stress in his life. But I think he was big enough and good enough to get out of it. And I'm still very pleased what he's left behind.
It seems that with the state of the agriculture probably wasn't great at that time either. And I think it was a culmination of those things. But yes, he was held in such a high esteem by his peers that they all rallied round and paid his debts off. So somebody must have thought a lot of him, Clive, in the same way that you do. Maybe the oldest bunged a tenner here and there. But I believe, was it the Duke of Bedford, I think, threw in a couple of £100. So between them, they bailed him out, and he carried on going, so that's good. And we also mentioned, while we're talking about the great man here, he took in students, and you touched on it earlier on, George Cully, who then went on to be a very successful shorthorn breeder, who our listeners will have heard about in one of our previous podcasts, and then subsequently firstly Charles Collins and then Robert Collins, so the Collins brothers. So you've probably got three of the top shorthorn breeders in the beginning of the shorthorns, who all used his methods to develop the shorthorn breed, which I think in turn could have been said to have caused the demise of the Longhorn breed. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes.
Yes, it did, Andy. But it is said of him in his life, it was his materials that failed and not his principles, because those three gentlemen that you've mentioned were very close contacts with him. They would have learnt so much from him, and therefore is why they in turn became successful stock people.
Yeah. Clive, although Bakewell is considered to be the father of the Longhorn, and subsequently many other breeds in the UK, the Longhorn actually does predate Bakewell by a couple of hundred years, going back to medieval times, I believe. And there was talk of Charnwood Forest, which covered at the time 18,000 acres of the Midlands, where these Longhorns would roam almost feral, I think, up until, and maybe after Bakewell's time as well. Some of these early breeders would ride out and admire the breed in their natural habitat. So these things had been around, hadn't they? He was improving them, but he wasn't inventing them.
No. Although the reason he used Longhorns for his beef production experiments is because they were there and available to him. They'd be highly popular in the Midland counties, but had spread throughout. I think they were probably, arguably, first developed in the north of England and probably up the west coast in Westmoreland, Cumberland, but spread, and they're part of our sort of primitive range of cattle they're mostly identified by the white finch that runs along their spine down through their tail. So we've got other examples like in the Gloucesters or the Irish Moiled, for instance, who are similar to that. And so that's why I think Bakewell was associated with the Longhorn breed, because they'd become very popular in Midland counties. They'd be all around him. And what he cleverly did with them was select what he felt was the best, and particularly to drive his methods onwards and forwards. And he did it most successfully, and the breed became extremely popular in his lifetime. That was the problem. There probably wasn't an heir to go on and develop the breed further. Then with his work with what became shorthorn breeders, of course, they were a bit more practical in their methods, simply because of the horns. As a result, probably well outnumbered the Longhorns, and indeed the Longhorn breed became extremely rare in the middle of the 20th century or just before, and it's a great attribute to the people that have stuck with them and moved on into the breed and developed them into the modern breed that they now are.
One thing our listeners might be thinking is, if he was such an advocate of line breeding and inbreeding, maybe he should have married his sister, but it's possible.
Well, I think it was his sister that married, because his nephew did follow him, but perhaps he was better at
breeding people. You're right, possibly. And the actual, going back to the Longhorn, the actual founder of the Longhorn breed could be considered a guy called Sir Thomas Gresley from Burton-on-Trent, and his pure herd was established around 1700. So we are talking, quite a considerable time earlier. And then a chap called John Webster of Canley, who bought his stock from Sir Thomas. So those were the two original breeders, and the latter one of those bred a bull sold as a yearling to a Mr. Blocksledge, and then the bull bred that well that he purchased him back again. After realised how well he was breeding, and after a couple of seasons, this bull Blocksledge, as he became known, was sold a couple of more times to a few other people as well, so leaving stock in 3 or 4 herds. And Webster went on to become incidentally the High Sheriff of Warwickshire, and coincidentally is buried in Stoneleigh Church, which is right next to the Royal Showground, which we'll go on to in a second. Is probably somewhere that the breed took the revival from, so it goes round.
And of course it was the bloodlines of those two breeders that you mentioned that Bakewell picked up on, really, Andy. So they certainly did have a big influence in the merits of the breed. And
Bakewell, as you said, started his herd with 2 heifers from Canley and a bull from Westmoreland, and along with George Chapman of Nuneaton, another guy we'll talk about in a second, these 3 breeders would exchange blood for many generations. So for all he was the master breeder, he did have people a bit like some of these the breeders almost where they've got a cartel where they're just exchanging sheep between, or they're exchanging sort of animals between 2 or 3 and then buying their own blood back in without actually getting too far afield from the gene pool. And I mentioned earlier on about the letting of sires, and of course this again became a huge benefit to the growth and improvement of the Longhorn breed. Local shows like Market Bosworth were revised and included animals for hire as well as for sale. So you could basically rock up and just like a shop almost and pick, I want to hire that one, I want to hire that. And I realised, of course, I had a neighbour called Ray Godwin, Clive, of course, with a neighbour of yours as well. And of course, the hiring of bulls carried on because I remember Ray still hiring bulls out through, of course, into the 90s.
That was a great thing. What really scuppered that trade is all the modern day requirements of movement license and disease control. Certainly Ray, who was a really popular fellow in the Midland counties and well beyond, and quite a character, wasn't he? Excellent chap.
So the shows like Market Bosworth, of course, they included animals for hire as well as for sale, and that show eventually merged into the Leicester County show some decades later that Peter alluded to. And Longhorns could also have been found in Ireland at the turn of the 19th century, and as in a lot of breeds, I suppose, and seemingly there were some damn good ones there, and suppose that some of these had been exported a few hundred years earlier and then improved upon in parts by men across the land there. But Bakewell admitted there were some excellent Longhorns in Ireland, and even more so after he sold them a whole tump of his own cattle in 1771. And Bakewell also reports in selling a bull to Jamaica, which just how a Jamaican came across and found him, I don't know, but the bull went to Jamaica and it thrived in their climate there for 12 years before the buyer eventually came back and bought another one. So pretty versatile breed if you can live in Jamaica. There's not a lot to eat over there, I wouldn't have thought. If we take a closer look at Bakewell's efforts, it's pretty obvious that his methods were revolutionary, as Clive said, and until that time, improving a breed basically meant using females from the local vicinity and then outcrossing those with a bull from somewhere else. And the legendary Bob Adam, I remember reading a speech that he gave about line breeding to the New Zealand Aberdeen Angus conference. And Bob said he described this haphazard practice of as a union of nobody's son with everybody's daughter, which I think is a great phrase for just randomly breeding things. And I realised that phrase that he used then, he'd stolen from one of Bakewell's contemporaries 200 years earlier. So these guys weren't having that. Everything was bred by a method, and everything was bred close, wasn't it? Studying his methods, it's quite remarkable how, with the use of intelligent line breeding, he did redevelop the breed out of all recognition in such a short period, really. And it's the length of time, as Clive said earlier on. But we did say that he had some big cattle to work with, and if he's looking to lighten the bone and bring them down a little bit, it would prove a little bit easier than going in another direction. And we mentioned earlier that Bakewell was quite secretive about his practices, and this could be put down to the fact that not everybody agreed, of course, with line breeding or with close matings that he was working with, stating them as being irreligious, which basically means it was immoral, doesn't it? And But it makes it quite difficult to chart the pedigrees of his early cattle. And I know Clive came somewhere, which I think we'll put on our Facebook page later, of the breeding of one of the early bulls and how, the exact pedigree of it as it was shown. But we mentioned that he started with two heifers and bred up from those, but there would be others, wouldn't there? They probably would have been Longhorns at Dishley before he bought these two good ones, I suppose, and they all would have come into the mix, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I'm sure he did, and because he'd need the numbers to stock the farm, so he'd be certainly working with more than a couple of breeders. But I think, like as we all experience when we're breeding stock, we have different lines that are various lines that are more successful. And I think in those Webster heifers that he picked up, that's definitely what happened, because that animal that you referred to, that's very closely bred, or the way that he put those genetics in a very close breeding program, was developed from a bull that he had called Two Penny. Mm-hmm. And I have picked up somewhere that that bull got his name, which reflects that Bakewell had a bit of a sense of humour as well, in that this bull wasn't perhaps the greatest looking in the world, although I have heard that he was broad through the back, and I mean, what more do you want in a beef animal? But somebody commented to him that they wouldn't give him tuppence for this bull, and that's why his name was Two Penny. And he was basically mating that bull to his own daughters, and over several generations, and it eventually developed into some of the, of that time, some of the best performing stock, particularly a bull called Shakespeare, who was very well. I think he made 400 guineas during his life and used for over a long period of time as well. So a long-lived bull, longevity was important, and so it was a recipe that worked.
And one of the earlier bulls I've got recorded here is called Old Cumley, and he lived to the age of 26. So you're right, the longevity, and I believe he was out of one of those Webster heifers. But there are conflicting reports about his parentage, as there are about the bull Two Penny as well. So I suppose that's the beauty of improving a breed, really, when nobody's watching over your shoulders. Exactly what you're doing is you can use another bull that out the other field that maybe wasn't quite what you said he was, and got away with him. Can't blame the guy with this. At the end of the day, he's starting with a hybrid and creating an exact and improved breed.
Because of course, with the Longhorns, Andy, we aren't quite so well documented as other breeds. Certainly, like for the Shorthorns and Herefords, for instance, and the Devons that had earlier herd books. The Longhorn Society didn't emerge until the late 1800s, and as a result, the herd book wasn't printed. And then, because the sort of demise of the breed, not many volumes of the herd were developed. So therefore, you haven't got that backbreeding record that one can refer to. But as we move forward with this great story, and Peter tells a bit about how he established his own herd at Fishock there, I mean, you will see that what they're doing now is superbly engineered and very well managed by some very dedicated stock people.
Well, Clive, thank you. I'm going to stop you there. We are looking forward to carrying on and listening to the history of this great Longhorn breed, and having on the programme great breeder Peter Close, who is still at the top of the breed now, and he has a lot of information going through from Bakewell's time through till the modern day. So I think we're going to break this one into another episode, and we'll catch up with you all in a few days there. Clive, thanks for your time. I really hope you've enjoyed hearing about the great Robert Bakewell and his fantastic contribution to the livestock world, and certainly fascinates me every time I hear and read about him. And again, thanks to my guest for, as usual, his unparalleled knowledge in that subject. And we'll look forward to chatting to you again another day. Thank you.
Yeah, and Happy New Year to you and everyone, Andy.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Top Lines and Tales. And as always, this week we were kindly sponsored by Harbro, manufacturers and suppliers of quality livestock nutrition and nutritional advice. Visit their website for more information, or follow them on Facebook. And while on the subject of Facebook, please tune into our Top Lines and Tales Facebook page, where there should be some photographs and documents to back up this week's and other episodes.